qui fait l'intendance dans la bibliothèque, Amdi, voilà, Amdi fait tout le temps des enregistrements. Donc, normalement, si vous ratez une conférence ici et vous allez dans le site du WARC, vous devriez trouver les enregistrements de Amdi. Je fais souvent des textes pour accompagner, mais ça fait un certain temps que je ne fais plus ces textes-là. Marianne, qui, bon, a la fâcheuse habitude de ne jamais se montrer en public, merci aussi. Hein, je ne sais pas, elle a peur de vous, elle se cache tout le temps. Je crois que son papa lui a donné une très bonne éducation. J'ai contribué à cette éducation-là, mais il me reste quelque chose à faire pour qu'elle puisse apparaître quand même. Hein, je voudrais vous dire qu'elle a été ancienne étudiante du département d'anglais. Donc, vous êtes assis sur les mêmes bancs et sur les mêmes tables. Une occasion pour vous encourager encore. Vous êtes à l'université, cherchez vos diplômes. Des postes, il y en aura toujours. Ceux qui sont là avant vous vont aller à la retraite et si vous n'êtes pas prêts, vous ne les remplacerez jamais. Franchement, ça, c'est un appel que je vous donne et soyez convaincus de ça plus que n'importe qui. Vous pouvez avoir votre licence, votre maîtrise, passer quelque temps à chômer, mais vous ne chômerez pas indéfiniment. Il faudrait quelque part que vous ayez quelque chose. Mais qu'on vous appelle ou que vous allez demander un travail et que vous disiez aux personnes qui doivent vous recruter, oui, j'ai pas ma licence parce que je faisais la grève, je n'y croyais pas, mais personne ne croira en vous. Sachez que ce sera votre tour un jour. Il faut vraiment y croire. Et je suis content que vous soyez là. Mais l'objet de cette rencontre-là, c'est que Madame Shobana Shankar est venue ici en tant que chercheur. Alors, l'histoire, c'est que je me rappelle ses premiers emails quand elle parlait de relations entre l'Inde et le Sénégal. Moi, je lui ai dit, et quand je disais ça, je parlais de quelque chose que vous ne connaissez pas beaucoup, parce que quand nous étions étudiants, moi j'étais un normalien, donc nous habitions à l'école normale supérieure, mais on avait développé une nouvelle mode. Il y avait un groupe un petit groupe là, on allait voir Mother India, Shashi Kapoor et tous ces grands noms du film indien. Mais quand j'étais beaucoup plus jeune, j'ai vu un film aussi qui était un film extraordinaire avec un personnage qu'on appelait Dara Singh. Alors Dara, c'était celui qui était très fort. Vous lui donnez ce bâtiment-là, il suffit que vous disiez « Vive Dara » et vous le voyez pousser le bâtiment et le faire tomber. Hein, ça, c'est les jours glorieux de Bollywood. Maintenant, il y a autre chose. Il y a le grand acteur qui s'appelle Khan et qui a failli avoir des problèmes récemment d'ailleurs parce que je crois que sa voiture avait percuté des mendiants et on lui a fait un procès, mais on ne l'a pas amené en prison parce qu'il est beaucoup trop populaire. Je crois que quelque part là, si on l'avait mis en prison pour homicide, il y aurait eu une révolution en Inde. Mais aussi Khan, c'est un musulman, je crois, et vous voyez un peu la situation en Inde. Vous voyez surtout les temples là et les trucs, mais il y a beaucoup de musulmans là-dedans. Si vous retournez à l'histoire, si vous voulez, du Commonwealth et de la colonisation britannique, vous voyez les relations qu'il y a eu entre le Pakistan et l'Inde jusqu'à ce que les deux pays soient séparés. Alors, mais Shobana est là pour nous parler d'autres relations qui existent ou qui pourraient exister entre le Sénégal et l'Inde. Donc c'est important. Je vous rappelle que hier, je suivais une émission. Il y a un monsieur qui a été envoyé pour des études supérieures en Inde. C'est votre professeur de linguistique, monsieur Faye, voilà, qui est au département de linguistique. C'est le président Senghor qui lui avait donné une bourse pour aller en Inde à cause de la présence dravidienne. C'est des Noirs qui sont en Inde. Ça aussi, c'est un filon important. Je vous dis aussi que la littérature indienne, le roman indien, est un des romans les plus prolifiques en ce moment. Peut-être que vous devriez y penser pour votre carrière future. Mais elle va vous parler de domaines de relations beaucoup plus divers. Elle s'intéresse à ce sujet-là et j'espère qu'elle va arriver quand même à produire un livre sur la coopération entre l'Inde et le Sénégal. Alors, on avait invité le personnel de l'ambassade de l'Inde, mais ils sont bloqués ils ont changé d'ambassadeur. Il y a un nouvel ambassadeur qui vient d'arriver. Alors c'est très compliqué, il faut mettre les choses en place. Ils nous ont envoyé un mail pour s'excuser. Donc voilà, Shobana va faire sa présentation devant vous. Je vous rappelle qu'elle est professeure d'histoire à Stony Brook. SUNY, c'est State University of New York. Il y a plusieurs campus, dont Binghamton, qui a envoyé des étudiants ici, et Stony Brook. Donc, Shobana, merci. Hein? Et sans trop tarder, je vais vous donner la parole. Je peux rester avec vous un instant, mais je peux aussi partir à tout moment. Merci de l'occasion.
Okay,
je vous donne la parole.
Merci beaucoup for the gracious introduction and all of the assistance and teranga I have received in Senegal. The purpose of my discussion today is to provide a history of the liaison between Senegal and India. This is one part of my book on India's special relationships in West Africa, different from East Africa and South Africa. And Senegal has a very important place, which I hope to show today. Today we see in Senegal the love of Indian culture, especially cinema, musique, dance, and we see Indian companies in Senegal, especially for chimique, to trade. But today I want to argue there is a longer cultural, intellectual, and spiritual relationship between Senegal and India. Multiple levels of this relationship. And there are two important arguments here. One, this relationship is based on the love of culture, especially cultural mixing or métissage. As you will see, this is a constant theme that Senegalese and Indians discussed from 1960s up into the 1980s. The second point I want to emphasize is that India was drawn to Senegal. In much research about Indians in Africa, the idea is that India influenced Africa, but not that Africa influenced India. So I want to change this idea and to say that there is something within Senegal that Indians were also attracted to and have been attracted to over several decades. Especially India was drawn to Senegal for its promise as an independent African nation with Senghor, poet-president at the head of state. So first and foremost, India saw Senegal as an intellectual country. The first image you have here is Senghor's visit to India, where he never had the chance to meet Nehru in person, the first Prime Minister of India, who they shared much mutual admiration, but he met his daughter Indira Gandhi in this picture. I have a proposal that to illustrate this shared love of métissage. On the left side, you see a quotation from the first Indian diplomat to Africa, the independent Indian government sent to Africa, Sri Appa Pant. He says, "Could one envisage a synthesis of all that was vital, satisfying, beautiful, and energizing from all the cults and cultures, backgrounds and histories, African, Indian, Islamic, and Christian? It was a dream of some of us that a new identity, a new personality should be developed to meet the fundamental social changes on their way. A personality more mature and more versatile, a new man for the modern age with the potential of a world citizen." He wrote this after his experience in Kenya, where he wanted to work with African leaders, but there was a lot of racial tension. The Kenyans were prevented from working with Indians because of African nationalism. On the other side, you have Senghor's words from 1974 when he went to Madras, today Chennai, to give a lecture. And you can read the French better than I can, but I will read it. "Nous avons répudié la négritude ghetto, ou, comme le disait Jean-Paul Sartre, le racisme antiraciste, nous avons découvert alors que les premières grandes civilisations étaient des civilisations de métissage culturel et d'abord biologique. Or donc, la négritude, pour nous, c'est aujourd'hui l'enracinement dans les valeurs des peuples noirs, mais en même temps l'ouverture aux autres civilisations. Je souhaite en terminant que cette rencontre à Madras ne soit pas un simple rose de printemps, mais le sommeil dont nous tirerons dans quelques années des riches moissons. Here, I think you see the shared vision of Indian politicians and Senghor at the same moment of decolonization, to enter the global scene with a new way that was not European and not purely native, but something that was mixed in the world. And in politics, there was also a movement, the Bandung movement. Many of you may be familiar, but you should be familiar, Afro-Asian Alliance from 1955 to navigate the Cold War between the United States and the European countries, Western European countries, and the USSR and China on the other side. The philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne has explored the spiritual and religious side of Senegalese socialism after independence. And he notes Senegal was unique for Catholic-Muslim convergence, and there was a profound engagement with this idea of the spiritual socialism. I want to add that Senegal was also exploring Indian spiritualism at this time to shape its idea of Senghor's vision of a new person or a new person of color in the world in the 1960s. So my paper is going to address these issues, and I will just tell you some of the sources. I did research here in Senegal, pas dans les archives, parce que les archives sont fermées. C'est difficile, but when there are documents, I have used those documents like these images. This is from Fondation Senghor. Documents from India. I did research in India and found many mentions of West Africa and Senegal specifically in the Indian National Archives. And I have also done interviews with Professor Fai, with his Indian professor who lived in Dakar for 7 years, and I'll be sharing some of this research today. But today I won't be talking about Andoufil and some of the cinema which will be in the book, because I want to address the highest level of relationship so we may think about the future. What can this past tell us about Senegal-India relationships in the future, as well as Asian-African relationships as we talk about China and other Asian countries' growing influence in Africa. The discussion has 3 parts. First, to demonstrate, as Professor Sen, that Muslims in India, starting in the era of decolonization, were very interested in West Africa. And I will explain why. This was the first cultural attachment of India to West Africa. Second part, the influence of Muslim Indians on India's new government in developing relations with West Africa and Senegal in particular. And the third part, what did Senegal mean for India? The 1962 is the year the embassy opened here in Dakar for covering several countries. And I will talk about this relationship between 1962 and 1980. So the first section of the paper, you see in this picture a picture of members of a special sect called the Ahmadiyya. It is a sect that formed in Punjab, India in the 1880s, an Islamic sect, though their ideas were challenged by other Muslims, that became very important in India to address the political problems of Muslims in India. From the 1920s, especially up until the partition of India, this challenges between Hindus and Muslims became very tense. So here you find these Indian members of this sect, the Ahmadiyya, in the 1920s, first going to the United States, learning about Pan-Africanism in the United States, that is the Black movement for unification around the world, and using this movement to begin work in West Africa. So the first place that the Indian missionaries, Muslim missionaries went was Gold Coast, or Ghana. And these are two Gold Coast converts you see in this image. Now, it is important to see that the Africans influenced the Indians to think about race and racial equality. So here I have two quotations from the Ahmadiyya discussing racial equality, and that Islam is the religion that protects racial equality. This was the argument that they made in 1927. And I'll read the quotes. "The Holy Quran teaches us a golden maxim, which if actually carried into action might prove a source of infinite good. O you men, surely we have created you of a male and female and made you tribes and families that you may know each other. Surely Allah is knowing. Aware, a division into nations, tribes, and families should not lead to estrangement from, but to a better knowledge of each other." They go on to say, "The majority of Muslims of India are recruited from the original inhabitants of the country, the Parayas and untouchables." The Parayas were the lowest caste of people in the Hindu system. But as soon as these people embraced Islam, they were admitted into the society with the same fairness and magnanimity as if they were Sayyid for ages. The general who commanded the Pathan, that is the Afghan army, during the days of Sultana Razia was no other than a black Abyssinian. The first general who led the Muslim army into the land of the Nile was no other than a black Othello. The first muezzin of Islam was a slave, a Negro. In India, we find a dynasty who is known by the proud title of slave dynasty, came as they were from the status of slaves. In short, as we proceed through the pages of the Islamic history, the same example of equality and brotherhood will meet us in every page. The salvation of the depressed classes lies in Islam and Islam alone. So a few things I want to say here. India has a black population descended from Africans who had been brought as slaves to India during the height of the Mughal Empire. A Senegalese woman, Sylviane Diouf, has produced a beautiful exhibit about this subject. I met her in Delhi. She came to the presentation and gave a speech and a lecture. And what you can see here is that Muslim Indians had seen that Islam had reduced the differences of color. And you see them invoking this at a time when India was thinking about becoming a new nation, and how Muslims would fit into this picture of a new nation. So they're arguing that only Islam can provide this equality for democracy. And this was through the influence of meeting African Americans and Marcus Garvey's followers in the United States and in Ghana. Now, also, I should point out, people emphasize Gandhi's religious activism. Gandhi was first influenced by the Khilafat movement in the 1910s, which was an Islamic movement during World War I for the protection of the holy sites in Arabia. So, in fact, Gandhi learned a lot about political organization from Muslim organizers. So you can see the same influence that the Ahmadiyya began to have on the Indian government. Here I have a quote from 1948, after Indian independence. "The intentions of the Christian West with regard to Africa are now an open secret. The British Labour Party has declared that the salvation of Europe lies in the prosperity and union of Africa. With such visible interest in the dark continent, Europe is also aware of the fact that the prosperity of Africa can benefit Europe only if Africans become Christian." Ahmadiyya, the missionary organization, spotted this secret about 24 years ago and sent her missionaries to Africa. As a result of this timely actions, thousands of people abandoned Christianity and became Muslim. So you can see that the Indian Muslim missionaries see the competition with Europe in Africa, But at the same time, after they have gotten independence, they feel that the way to lead or help Africans get independence from Europe is to reject Christianity. So this anti-missionary position is very strong in India. And this came out particularly as more and more Indians were looking to West Africa, where there were many Christian missionaries, particularly British West Africa, Gold Coast and Nigeria. So the Indian government seized the actions of the Ahmadiyya in West Africa and began to be influenced by it. From the 1950s, the government of India sponsored trips of Hindu religious activists to British Africa. And one, he met with the Muslim missionaries, the Indian Muslim missionaries in West Africa, and this is what he said. Indians should establish a center that was completely multi-religious and multiracial in West Africa, in which the people gathering for philosophic and religious discussions would have the opportunity of forming their own views. So the Indians felt that they should not be evangelizing. They should not convert Africans in West Africa, but rather hold philosophic, intellectual, multi-religious discussions with no racial separation. And as I mentioned before, this was also because of the racial separation in Kenya that the Indians had seen, and of course in South Africa by this time. The Muslim Indian Welfare Society of East Africa sent people to Gold Coast, Congo, AOF, including Senegal and French Sudan in the 1950s. So here you see, what I'm emphasizing is that India made her first connections to West Africa through cultural, religious, philosophical missions, not economic. Equally, the Aga Khan, who maybe you are familiar with, also sent his representatives to countries in West Africa and said we should not have a religious program, and he tried to explain that religious conflict should be prevented in finding independence after the Europeans left. So there are two things here. Why did the Indians think this way? One problem that the Indians faced in West Africa was propaganda by the British. The British spread everywhere, or this was the Indian perception, that Indians were anti-Muslim. And this is why partition happened between Pakistan and India. So India wanted to promote its multi-religious history. The second problem was the French had also began propaganda in West Africa because several parts of French India, or one part of French India, had not joined the French at decolonization. Like French West Africa had a vote to join France, to stay with France, or to become independent. Within India, the same vote occurred. You see, there were 5 French Indian territories: Chandarnagar, which is near Calcutta or Kolkata today, Yangon, Pondicherry in southeast, and Mahe in southwest, and Karikal in southeast as well. In 1949, Chandarnagar was the only French territory to go with India. But there was a lot of pressure for the others to join India, so they were naturally torn. In West Africa, you experience the same difficult decision. Is it better to keep ties with the French, or is it better to become independent? So the French were also promoting this idea, it is better to stay with the French in independence, or keep the relationship with the French, particularly in India because they were a minority. So this is what Indians had to fight in West Africa, this propaganda. But Indians' views of West Africa, I have to share in these quotes, show that there was considerable admiration for the independence of West Africans. Sri Appa Pant, the first diplomat who had been in Kenya, came to West Africa and he said, the West, meaning the Western countries, will not influence this part of Africa in the sense that West Africans will never be subservient to the rule of the West or will ever become an imitation of the West. West Africa will remain West Africa after absorbing all the Western capitalism has to give. So, in essence, he is comparing East Africa and West Africa to say that West Africa was never fully dominated by the European countries. The Indian Council on Cultural Relations, which sponsors student exchange, said the African in East Africa is backward educationally. West Africa, and particularly the Gold Coast, presents a different picture. Now, this is before Ghanaian independence, 1957. This is what the Indians know of West Africa, but you can see their idea is changing is forming West Africa as a place where intellectual missions will produce the best kind of diplomatic relationships. So now turning to Senegal's special relationship with India. The key person who facilitated this relationship was a man named Malcolm Adiseshaya, who was the director of UNESCO from 1950. And Senghor met him in Paris, and they became friends and stayed friends for many decades. And Senghor, through Adiseshaya, learned of this idea of Lemuria, which is this idea that there was a land when India and Africa were connected. And that because of that land connection, there were ancient roots that were common to Africa and South India, particularly the so-called Dravidian cultures. Adiseshaya himself was a Catholic and was also from South India. Adiseshaya was also very much attracted to Senghor because he was unhappy with the relationship between Kenyans and Indians. In particular, he said East African students who had been brought to India for university were very hostile to the Indians. They had come through the UNESCO Technical Assistance Program. So through these connections, in 1962, the embassy in Dakar is opened. This is also the same year, the founding of the cultural organization Les Amis de l'Inde. And the filmmaker Mansour Sohrawad has made a film that is not finished yet, but we're hoping to work together to finish it and release it to audiences. And this is when the love of cinema is very clear in Senegal as well. In fact, you can say that they are separate. There's a diplomatic relationship and there's a popular culture relationship. One did not found the other, but that shows you there were multiple ideas about India in Senegal. After the embassy was open, India really began to develop a very strong relationship with Senegal. And here I have some quotations from the first ambassador to Senegal, who also traveling within Senegal and also going to Burkina and other territories he was the ambassador from Senegal. He says about his trip, or about the way Africans saw him, they were impressed by my doctorate in philosophy, but when they learned my subject was political science, they were distinctly disappointed. They would rather have philosophy than anything else. The longer I stay in Africa, the more I am convinced that they are not so much inspired by our economic and industrial achievements as by our spiritual and philosophical attainments in the past. They know very little about modern India, but what captures their imagination is not the Bakra Dam or the Chittaranjan factory or the Are milk colony, but our ancient temples, our philosophy and rituals, our sculpture and our handicrafts. And I almost forgot the sari, of course. They think our women are very feminine and attractive. They like our cultural values and our indigenous customs, which are so different from those of Europe, which they know. They explain that a big factory or a big hydroelectric scheme is something which they can see anywhere in the world. It is common and means nothing to them. With French and American aid, they too can have these and will have these in due course. But what they cannot have and never will have are the cultural and spiritual values and the philosophy of India they have heard so much about. I can only hope we shall bear this in mind when we think of publicity and cultural relations with African countries. So, a few things I want to draw here. You can see that the relationship between Senegal and India shows a different definition of development. Today we think of development as economic and economic primarily. You can see that in this era of Senghor's thought, spiritual, philosophical, and historical achievements were a crucial part of a country's development. I think this is very significant to point out that history as a subject to study was very significant during this period. And I say this because many people don't want to study history now. So you can see the admiration that the Indian ambassador has for Francophone West Africa in particular. So the Indians went from contrasting East Africa and West Africa to contrasting French Africa, French-speaking Africa, to English-speaking Africa. So in this era, there were several projects that I'll just list here. In 1968, Senghor became the chair of the celebration committee for the Gandhi centenary. And there's an exhibit was at the Sorano Theater that was attended by Monsieur Amadou Mahtar, who also became the head of UNESCO. I want to emphasize that the Indians saw Senghor as continuing the legacy of Gandhi in India. This is very significant in that Gandhi, as a national hero to most, not all, in India, that his work would be continued in Africa by not somebody from South Africa, because South Africa at this point was under apartheid, but by Senghor, especially because he represented a country that was peaceful at a time when coups had begun. And this is in the documents, the idea that peace, that Senghor was a peacemaker, was very strong. We also have these Andophile clubs that had started already by this time, centered on films and music. The Indian Council of Cultural Relations sponsored university exchange. Indian professors came to Dakar, and Indian and Senegalese professors and students went to India, which I'll focus on. And Senghor, in 1977, inaugurated the Department of Indo-African Studies at IFAM in 1977. And also the dance school Mudra Afrique, which was existing between 1977 and 1985. So you see so many projects. It's impossible to capture the relationship between these countries with one phrase or one idea. It's a rich relationship. So I want to focus on the university exchanges. This professor, U.P. Upadhyaya, I had the opportunity to interview him in 2015, last year in Mangaluru. He lived here in Dakar between 1973 and 1980. He's a linguist of Dravidian linguistics, and he was chosen in 1972 to come to Dakar because the Indian government had received the request from Senghor for researchers to learn more about the subject of Dravidian West African connections. He came with his wife, Dr. Sushila Upadhyaya, and she's receiving an award here from Monsieur Senghor at the foundation. And I just wanted to read from here this book about them that I found in India, that I bought in India, where they said that, thank you, that Dr. Sushila would be a sort of unofficial ambassador of Indian culture in Senegal. She would disseminate information about Indian culture to the people of Senegal, was the suggestion made by the Indian official who gave them this assignment. And she also, she gave talks about Indian dress and Indian food, and she created interest in the Indian culture among the people of Senegal. They became very popular at Dakar University campus. They were a very interesting couple, And then also, this is a picture that Professor Fai let me take a picture of. This is a picture of his days in India at Annamalai University, where my father also went. And you can see Professor Fai here in the back with Professor Njai also.
Okay.
And you can see here, I think, this is foreign students, and you can see that actually most of them look Asian. So Professor Fai was among few, but there were also some other students from other places. So it's a fascinating idea that these linguists were exchanging ideas and research about common language patterns that we have, that we shared, common words and ideas that we shared, as well as common history and beliefs. Professor Fai discussed with me also some of the customs and traditions that we practice that we can talk more about, and days for, of course, words for ki, chabi, word for skin, tol, which he says are similar in South Indian languages and West African Atlantic languages. So I just want to summarize some of the research findings from their research, and we can talk more about this. The first point is that up until this point, both Indian students as well as African students had been taught that it was Indo-Europeans who had founded the great civilizations of the world. Now, we already knew that Professor Diop was doing research on Egypt, the roots of Egypt, the African roots of Egyptian culture. Well, this project contributed the idea that Afro-Dravidian cultures had also contributed to civilization building in ancient times. And in fact, these professors, as well as another professor, Aravanan, were part of the Senegalese representation to the Festival for the Celebration of Black Arts and Cultures in Lagos in 1977. So these Indian scholars had become a part of Senegal, you can say, if they were to represent Black culture in Lagos in 1977. And there are many articles that they published about their findings. Very technical, some of them very technical. Another point that they emphasize is there's many kinds of métissage. So ancient métissage, the idea that somewhere there are historical roots that show the mixing of peoples, that people who are in two regions not connected to each other anymore could share so much, comes from ancient métissage. This word list that Professor Fai compiled, along with the other researchers, 200 words that are shared between Wolof, Tamil, and other languages. The question remains, do we have common roots? Essentially, he said Professor Fai told me, there are students interested in doing this research, but it's difficult research and there's no funding to do the research. Finally, the structures of our societies. The phrase that Professor Fai used is carrefour de culture. So here in Senegal, you have this meeting ground of peoples. Similarly, in South India, you have this ancient exchanges between people that have produced what we find today. This goes back to the idea of métissage, which, again, to come back to my first point, this really embodies the spirit of that time. Cultural, biological, spiritual métissage. Some other insights from the interviews that I was able to collect. About the Upadhyayas, the man in particular, he was from a very priestly background. He was from a Brahmin background. His father wanted him to be a priest. And he only got traditional priestly education, and then of his own, he decided to get Western education, and he had to pay for it. He struggled greatly. And he said to me that the anthropology, doing research with other peoples in India, not just people like himself, as well as in Africa, helped him see his own cultural background differently. He said or Senghor said in one of his speeches in 1985 in India that the Hindu aesthetique est un métissage biologique et culturel. This is a very important idea, that Hinduism is not purely from one source. So this man who had gone through the priestly training learned this through his studies. And he said Africans helped us and we helped them. So you see the mutual feeling. This was not simply we are bringing something to the Africans, but Africans helped us see our culture more clearly. And I think this is very different from the relationship between Europeans and non-Europeans. Europeans, for many centuries, had in scholarship decreed that there was no lasting influence of most civilizations in the world. But here you see Indians wanting to go back further in African history and Africans going back further in Indian history, ancient history. The last point he said was that this kind of work is difficult and must be done with precision. He felt this is a science, this is a research that needs investment. This is not something we do casually. And Professor Fay actually echoed this point, which I'll get to. I emphasize this because we are in an era where people are not funding humanities research. I hope this work, this historical work, shows the relevance that history or language study can have for cultural relationships or even political relationships. And so both of them commented, there's no investment in this kind of work, but it's a work that maybe scientists will say, oh, it's not very important. But you can see that there are many unanswered questions and mysteries that people could do research on. Now, Professor Fay had very interesting comments to make. He said, Indians were scared of me. They didn't know what to make of me. And I was scared of them. He said he felt that we Indians needed to learn more about Africans. And he, in the process, learned more about India. He said he became a Hindu African. He felt no barriers to his experience, learning yoga, going to temples, going to the mosque. He also cautioned that he felt he did not like the oversimplification of African beliefs and cultures in this research. He gave an example when one researcher argued that the Wolof worship the baobab as a god, and he said that's wrong. So I took this point very seriously because these researchers are very invested in correcting the misrepresentations of outsiders about their culture or their languages or their history. It is only through those kinds of deep research that people can actually find those mistakes and correct them in a scientific way. So this goes back, he echoed the same thing that the Indian professor said. We have to do this kind of research with a very scientific mind. And then he also made some comments about in religion in India. He felt there were no barriers in religion, and he felt there was religious cooperation, which he appreciated as he found in Senegal. But he also had a very interesting comment. He said, the Senegalese are more knowledgeable about Islam than Indians. And I found this very interesting because I found the idea that cultures coming together, one is able to see, I don't want to say flaws, but actually the idea there's no one is superior to anybody else. And I think Professor Fay really had this idea that he could have this kind of exchange with Indians too, to say, well, in Senegal we do things very differently. He described going to a Muslim wedding. After the wedding, the people didn't even give any food to the imam or the cleric who had performed the function, and he said here in Senegal, the marabout would first get the best food from the. But in any case, so he had these kind of interesting ethnological points that I think points to the idea that we have to immerse ourselves in each other's cultures. So my conclusion. Both of these professors said, Professor Upadhyaya said, when they talked to me, you see, they wrote a book about him. There's 2 or 3 paragraphs about Senegal. He said, nobody asks us about our work in Africa. Professor Fai said, there are students here who would like to study this. I have students I could send, but there's no funding. Why don't we bring back a program like this? So I asked the question, have we lost the imagination for intellectual and cultural exchange in today's world? Are we emphasizing other things in development except these very important pieces that brought us together? Going back to Suleiman Bashir Jian, he asks in one of his essays, can we continue Senghorian discussions without Senghor? Can we continue Nehruvian discussions? Can we continue his vision without Nehru? And I think we have to seriously consider this idea that in that time and place, there was very revolutionary ideas and practices that could bring, that we could return to. To another point, it's been argued by this scholar David McCormick, that India has played a non-monetary role in Africa, that is giving scholarships, technical training, in contrast to China that gives lending money, often a monetary role. I think as we talk about South-South relationships, Asian-African relationships, we need to distinguish what the nature of those relationships are. Is India's relationship with Senegalese different than China's relationship with Senegalese, for example? And then another point, going back to this dream of a world citizen, does that exist anymore? Do any of us have that dream anymore? It's interesting to contemplate that maybe if we don't, maybe it's a romantic idea that doesn't have relevance anymore. Maybe we've achieved that. And the final point is that I do believe, in speaking to Indians in Senegal now, they really do believe that culture is what makes the economic ties stronger. The love of Indian films, the love of Indian dress, the intellectual relationship, this is what makes it possible to do the other kinds of things. And if that is the case, then perhaps we should talk about more of those issues as we think about development today. Thank you.
Bon, je suis content d'être resté un peu. Et de plus en plus, je suis en train de me dire, est-ce que finalement, l'ambassade de l'Inde ici ne devrait pas faire des efforts avec le département d'anglais? Et je leur ai proposé ça, parce que c'est eux qui m'ont financé un voyage à Delhi il y a 2 ans. Et quand je suis venu, je leur ai dit, il faudrait faire un effort pour qu'au département d'anglais, on puisse avoir quand même un professeur ou 2 professeurs qui puissent exposer les étudiants à la littérature indienne. Bon, je leur ai donné mon rapport, je leur ai fait la suggestion, on s'est arrêté là. Mais même l'objet de la conférence à laquelle je participais à Delhi est significatif de ce point de vue. Permettez-moi de développer quelques points et de vous donner la parole après. Parce qu'il s'agissait de voir comment le développement était possible sans qu'on puisse se départir de nos différentes identités. Alors, il s'est passé quelque chose ce jour-là, ou ces 2 ou 3 jours, de très intéressant. Parce que moi, je cherchais l'angle par lequel j'allais aborder la question. Notre premier jour, pas le jour où je suis arrivé, le lendemain, je me suis habillé en vrai Sénégalais avec mon bazin et tout ça. Mais tout le monde me disait « You Royal », parce qu'il voyait cette tenue pour la première fois. Et quand on est allé dans la salle, il fallait essayer de discuter un peu comment on peut se moderniser sans s'occidentaliser. On peut emprunter des autres sans être nécessairement les autres. Ce n'est pas la peine. Or, et là, j'étais là, je me dis, mais ces gens-là, ils m'appellent Royal. Mais ils m'appellent Royal à travers quoi? Ce que j'ai porté. Ce que j'ai porté, c'est exactement quoi? Il y en a qui l'appellent Turquie. Il y en a qui l'appellent Khaftan. Il y en a qui l'appellent sabador. Ces 3 mots-là ne nous appartiennent pas. Turquie déjà vous montre que ce qu'on porte a une influence turque au départ. Sabador, ce n'est pas un mot wolof. Turquie, ce n'est pas un mot wolof. Donc, ce que nous portons, le premier modèle, nous est venu de l'extérieur. Mais ce modèle-là, on l'a tellement travaillé qu'un sabador, qu'un nyati abdou, cousu par un tailleur sénégalais, ne peut en aucune façon ressembler à ce qu'un Turc mettrait sur le marché. C'est impossible. Et donc, mon identité va avec ce sabador-là, ou ces 2 pièces ou 3 pièces, mais l'origine de cet élément-là que je porte, ce n'est pas une origine autochtone, c'est venu d'ailleurs. Et c'est une adaptation absolument parfaite qui fait que le Sénégalais, l'élégance sénégalaise, on identifie ça à travers cet habit-là. Mais elle a beaucoup parlé de Senghor, mais Senghor, ce n'est pas autre chose. Enracinement et ouverture. Elle a dit que Senghor est la continuation de Gandhi, mais Senghor, ce n'est pas autre chose. Parce que si vous dites chez Senghor enracinement et ouverture, vous dites en même temps et au même moment la réconciliation des contraires. L'un des éléments fondamentaux de la pensée de Senghor, c'est qu'il n'y a jamais dans la vie des éléments qui sont antagonistes éternellement. La mort se trouve dans la vie se trouve dans la mort. Le blanc et le noir se trouvent être ensemble. Je chante ta beauté qui passe avant que le destin jaloux ne te réduise en cendres pour nourrir les racines de la vie. Écoutez à nouveau, je chante femme nue, femme obscure ou femme noire, je chante ta beauté qui passe, forme que je fixe dans l'éternel avant que le destin jaloux ne te réduise en cendres pour nourrir les racines de la vie. Que le destin jaloux ne te réduise en cendres. Si vous êtes réduit en cendres, vous êtes mort. Mais comment cette mort-là peut-elle nourrir les racines de la vie? Oui, mais il suffit d'interroger nos propres réalités pour savoir que c'est une vérité. Si vous avez votre champ dans les villages, mais au mois de mai, vous commencez à couper tous les arbres, toutes les petites herbes et toutes les petites plantes. Qu'est-ce que vous faites après? Vous brûlez, c'est de la cendre. Mais si vous prenez votre arachide ou votre mil, vous le semez dans votre champ, là où il y a cette cendre-là, c'est là où vous aurez les meilleurs plants de votre champ. Donc la mort nourrit la vie. Et le cheminement, le jeu de Senghor, c'est en permanence ça, faire en sorte que les contraires finissent par se réconcilier. C'est pour ça que pour lui, il parle de métissage. Aussi bien métissage biologique que métissage culturel. Et ceci est tellement vrai qu'il n'y a aucune culture qui soit authentiquement pure. Il y a toujours des emprunts. Il y a toujours des emprunts. Personne ne peut dire « je suis un Wolof pur » parce que le Wolof est allé s'allaiter à une source qui n'a rien à voir avec le Wolof. Le Sérère lui-même, c'est la même chose. On s'interpénètre. Mais si vous vous interpénétrez, mais vous supprimez les antagonismes. Dans ces conditions, il est le continuateur de Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. Il y a beaucoup de choses ici qui sont là, si vous voulez, qui nous lient à l'Inde. Nous aspirons au développement. Mais fondamentalement, il faut qu'on aspire au développement différemment des autres. En nous développant, donc, nous ne nous européanisons pas, we are not being westernized, nous nous modernisons. Allez en Inde. J'ai vu le vice-premier ministre indien. Je crois que chez eux, toujours, le vice-premier ministre, il est musulman. Mais voyez ce qu'il porte. Regardez le premier ministre, ce qu'il porte. Regardez les Indiens, même les plus intellectuels, les plus éduqués, ce qu'ils portent le plus souvent. Ils ont les langues occidentales Ils connaissent toutes ces matières que l'on a à l'université, mais quand il le faut, ils savent faire leur rituel. Or, l'Occident s'est occidentalisé davantage, parce que s'il y a quelque chose qui manque le plus à l'Occident maintenant, c'est la spiritualité. Quel Indien n'est donc pas spirituel? Quel Sénégalais n'est donc pas spirituel? Dans l'islam, dans le christianisme ou dans d'autres pratiques. Et on est tellement spirituel ici qu'on a fait une sorte de syncrétisme, c'est-à-dire la capacité d'avoir l'islam en nous à 100%, tout en respectant certaines pratiques ou certaines croyances traditionnelles. Parce que tout ce que l'islam n'interdit pas est acceptable. Et ces choses-là nous lient avec l'Inde. Autre chose, mais elle a raison de parler de l'islam comme ça. Mais c'est l'islam qui a affranchi Bilal. Bilal, avant d'être le muezzin qu'il était, le disciple du prophète, qui a le plus combattu avec le prophète, Bilal était un esclave. Vous devenez musulman, à partir de ce moment, vous avez tous les droits parce qu'un musulman ne saurait être l'esclave de l'autre. Mais chez eux aussi, l'islam a joué le même rôle, puisque il y a une ressemblance entre l'Inde et le Sénégal, c'est ce qu'on appelle social stratification, la stratification sociale. Et chez eux, c'est encore plus fort que chez nous. Un grand marabout, un érudit de l'islam chez nous, qu'il soit d'origine Teug, Laoubé ou Gewel, ça n'apparaît plus. Dès l'instant qu'il est le grand, celui qui dirige la prière, celui qui inspire sur le plan religieux, là d'où il vient sur le plan caste, on oublie ça. De la même façon, chez eux, il y a des castes, les parias et les intouchables. Dès l'instant que vous devenez musulman, on ne vous range plus parmi les catégories les plus méprisées. L'islam vous élève. Et ce phénomène-là, vous l'avez au Sénégal, vous l'avez aussi en Inde. Alors, la différence, il a parlé des problèmes avec l'Afrique de l'Est. Mais ça aussi, c'est historique. Les relations entre les Indiens et les Ouest-Africains, et les Indiens et les East Africans, ça ne peut pas être la même chose. Parce que la pénétration ou l'arrivée d'Indiens au Sénégal ne peut pas être la même chose. Parce que, avec la colonisation, si vous voulez, les Indiens ont joué à peu près le même rôle que les Libanais. C'est-à-dire que dans l'organisation des activités économiques, les Indiens en Afrique de l'Est étaient les intermédiaires des grossistes occidentaux britanniques. De la même façon que ici, les Libanais étaient les intermédiaires des grossistes français. Vézia, Morel-le-Prom, Chavanel, ces comptoirs français qui étaient à Saint-Louis et à Dakar, éclataient leurs marchandises et les écoulaient dans les petites villes comme Sokone, comme Gandiaï. Mais là-bas qu'il y avait, c'était les Libanais. C'était les Libanais. Les Libanais, c'était une classe supérieure déjà, d'autant plus qu'économiquement, ils étaient endowed. Mais vous avez la stratification, les Touaps, les Européens, les Libanais et après les autochtones. Dans les pays colonisés par les Britanniques, ça a été exactement la même chose, surtout en Afrique de l'Est et en Afrique de l'Ouest. Non, en Afrique de l'Est et en Afrique australe. Vous trouvez la même chose aussi en Sierra Leone. Donc, cette répartition ou cette discrimination économique correspond aussi à une discrimination raciale, ce qui fait qu'en Afrique du Sud, avant la fin de l'apartheid, vous aviez 4 groupes. Vous aviez les Blancs, vous aviez les Indiens, vous aviez the colored and the black. C'est ça. Donc c'est pas la même relation. Nous n'avons pas eu des Indiens ici qui viennent sur le plan économique, aider le français. Les Indiens étaient dans les colonies anglaises. Hein? Voilà vraiment autant de choses qui nous lient à l'Inde. Et ce que je voudrais dire, bon, enfin, elle a parlé d'autres choses, vous devez avoir un éclairage. La conférence de Bandung, Gamal Abdel Nasser, le Pandi Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, les Indonésiens, Sukarno, ils ont créé un mouvement qui était le mouvement des non-alignés. 55, c'est après 45. Or, la guerre froide, l'hostilité entre le bloc occidental et le bloc de l'Ouest, ça a commencé immédiatement après la guerre, la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. L'Union soviétique, l'IRSS, s'opposant aux États-Unis pour le contrôle du monde. Les pays du tiers-monde, les grands leaders du tiers-monde, you know, the guy from Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, mais surtout Gamal Abdel Nasser, le Pandi Nehru et Ahmed Sukarno de l'Indonésie, ils ont fait une grande conférence, c'était la conférence des non-alignés. Alors, le mouvement des non-alignés n'a plus d'importance maintenant, on en parle de temps en temps, mais c'était ces pays-là en développement qui ne voulaient être ni avec les Américains, ni avec les Russes, ni avec les capitalistes, ni avec les communistes. Et le grand dirigeant de la Yougoslavie, Josip Broz Tito, le maréchal Tito. C'est ça les grands noms you know, du mouvement des non-alignés. Voilà donc autant d'éléments historiques qu'elle nous a rappelés, mais voilà autant d'éléments qui font que enseigner la littérature indienne ou enseigner la culture indienne au département d'anglais ou à l'université Cheikh Anta Diop se justifie beaucoup plus d'ailleurs que l'enseignement d'autres littératures qui sont en train d'entrer. Je vois beaucoup plus facilement la connexion avec l'Inde, excusez-moi, je ne fais pas de propagande, mais que la connexion avec le taoïsme ou les Chinois. Parce que franchement, sur le plan historique et sur le plan racial, il y a plein de choses qui nous lient à l'Inde. Je ne sais pas si je me ferai entendre, mais si jamais l'ambassadeur, le nouvel ambassadeur d'Inde exprimait le besoin de me voir, je lui parlerai encore de ce besoin. Et vous, ce que je suggère, j'espère que vous essaierez d'avoir des relations avec elle pour en savoir davantage. Mais pour certains d'entre vous, votre Master 1 ou votre Master 2, le seul problème, c'est qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup de documents. Comment ils vont faire pour se documenter? Mais essayez un peu d'aller et d'interroger l'Internet pour voir quels sont les livres en littérature indienne qui pourraient vous intéresser.
Senegalese and other Africans, but do you read scholarship by Asians? Or are you reading scholarship by French, American, Canadian scholars? There needs to be a decolonization of knowledge. So, I think Indians should read about caste in Monday World, and the Monday peoples should read about caste in India, because the way we see caste is very different, but we happen to have castes. But it's the Europeans who have, the French Dumont wrote about caste, and probably the Senegalese, like Senghor, read what the French had to say about caste, but not what Indian writers had to say about caste. You see what I mean? That we are not speaking to each other often because we are going through intermediaries who are European, which isn't wrong, but we should read everything, isn't it? So I think I think the popular culture is very important, but I think we may lose, if we only focus on the popular culture, we may lose this rich vein of interaction that we should have, and not, so that if someone is looking, they might say, oh, well, it's just Indian films that the Senegalese love. And there's been a lot of scholarship about Africans' love of Indian films. Well, that gives the wrong message, because one, it doesn't talk about how Africa has affected India. You see, it's as if India is the power replacing colonial power through media, let's say. Or that the only connection we have is colonialism, that we share colonialism, the history, and that's why we're attracted to each other's culture. I think there's a lot more to it. Race. You know, I think this is a new topic for Indians. And, you know, going back to what you said about Professor Njai, I spoke to Professor Njai and he told me about the problems that he had. And then eventually it improved. But, you know, Indians have to confront the issue of race. You see there are African students or Africans in India now who have had a lot of problems. I think back in this period, there were people who were interested in working on these issues, and maybe we're not working on those problems today, which is, again, maybe something to emphasize, like you say, what should be emphasized? Well, maybe the idea that after colonialism, there was a dream about non-racialism, like Senghor had, and Appa shared. They shared that, and we can have it. We in the we could be leaders in talking about race and racial tolerance, right? But instead, there are other countries that control that conversation, like the United States history of race. So these are just some examples. So just to summarize, I think popular culture is very important, but there's a whole world of popular culture. In fact, I noticed the Senegalese and Dufi, the people who love India, they understand the differences, the classical Indian dance versus the popular music, but popular dance. There is a very refined understanding of popular culture, of Indian popular culture in Senegal. That is to say, no Senegalese will, or these Senegalese intellectuals, they won't say Bharatanatyam, which is, you know, classical form of dance, is the same as Bollywood. Or the classical music of India is not the same as the Bollywood music. So popular culture is important, but a better understanding of each other's popular culture. And the second point I do think is the politics. I think that, you know, many countries now are fighting, you know, conservative extremism, and I think that to go back to the legacy of an open-mindedness is a good reminder that we have these, you know, we have democracy in our countries without being imported from other places.
Ouais. Je peux ajouter quelque chose là-dedans. Bon, on vous parle de post-colonialisme et de tout ça, mais la nécessité de procéder de la périphérie vers le centre, et que la périphérie ne soit plus la périphérie et que cette périphérie devienne le centre. Mais qu'est-ce que l'on fait pour cela? On n'avait pas l'impression que le monopole du savoir semble nous venir de l'Occident. Je vous pose une question toute simple. Si vous avez une dissertation à faire ici et maintenant, et s'il vous faut sortir une citation, vous allez citer qui? Bon, je vous dis plus grave encore, il y a 4 ou 5 ans, au théâtre de Sorano, le président Abdoulaye Wade avait présidé une cérémonie organisée avec l'université où il fallait célébrer l'excellence. Un professeur de l'université, éminemment intelligent et brillant, a fait un discours mémorable, tellement mémorable qu'Abdoulaye Wade l'a invité à aller à la présidence pour qu'il lui donne un cadeau là-bas. Mais mon problème avec ce professeur-là, c'est que toutes les citations qu'il a alignées, l'excellence, étaient des citations d'auteurs, de philosophes, de penseurs occidentaux. Je cite, c'est un Français. Je cite, c'est un Belge. Je cite, pas un seul Africain. Et j'étais là dans la salle et j'ai failli bondir pour lui dire, croyez-vous donc que Cheikh Amadou Bamba et El Hadji Malick Sy, dans leurs écrits, n'ont pas glorifié l'excellence? Qu'est-ce qui fait qu'un professeur aussi intelligent, aussi africain, n'ait pas éprouvé le besoin d'aller chercher une citation africaine plutôt que de nous aligner des citations occidentales? Et nous tous, nous faisons la même chose sans nous en rendre compte. Mais en Inde, il y a de grands penseurs, de grands musiciens. Ravi Shankar, tout le monde le connaît, mais la sagesse de Ravindra Tagore, tout le monde apprécie ça aussi. Et ce qu'ils disent se rapproche beaucoup plus de nous, parce que sociologiquement, nous nous rapprochons beaucoup plus de la structure familiale, la manière dont on respecte ça. Aucun enfant ne regardera son père en Inde ou au Sénégal pour dire Dad, you lying. N'importe quel enfant en Grande-Bretagne, en France ou aux États-Unis peut dire à son papa Dad, you lying. Donc on n'a pas les mêmes valeurs. Par contre, vous allez en Inde, vous voyez un peu l'organisation sociale traditionnelle, vous vous y retrouvez pratiquement. Et c'est ça, je crois que c'est cette nécessité d'inverser les choses. Mais je crois qu'on est intellectuellement paresseux. Les gens n'aiment pas se remettre en cause. Quelqu'un est britannique, il ne voudra pas penser à autre chose. Un américaniste à moi, encore que dans moi, c'est pas vrai. Parce que franchement, depuis que j'ai découvert certaines choses, je préfère vous enseigner la littérature africaine-américaine. Non pas par racisme, mais je me dis, cette littérature vous parle beaucoup plus que les autres. Il m'arrive d'introduire les Blancs. Je vais vous faire Scott Fitzgerald cette année. Vous allez vous y retrouver, mais vous vous y retrouvez beaucoup plus quand on vous parle de certaines choses qui ont des réverbérations et des répercussions avec l'Afrique. Et c'est un effort qu'on devrait faire. Et c'est pour ça que son exposé et sa recherche sont tellement intéressants de ce point de vue. Et il est de votre devoir de faire ce travail-là. C'est pour ça que je vous dis, essayez de voir comment vous allez écrire une lettre à l'ambassade de l'Inde pour l'amener à vous acheter beaucoup de romans et que vous découvriez la littérature indienne. On a le temps pour une autre question, une deuxième question. Oui.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to know, since India and Senegal have many similarities in the domain of culture. Okay, I wanted to know now. We were all colonized by white countries, the metropolitan countries, and then how to call it. And then today we got our independence, we free. But India, now we can in a past, in the time of being, we were all colonized. But now we can count India as how to call it, what we call the emerging countries. Since Senegal, now we are in the part of the underdeveloped countries. Now, I want to know what is the secret of India? How they come out of how to call it, their poverty, their problems. It is in the domain of in culture, or how to call it, economically or culturally. I want to know the secret, the difference. Since now in Senegal we're talking about emergency, and since we have a lot of similarities. The domain of culture, religiously, stuff like this. Sorry.
It's a very good question. I think it's one that has many dimensions to answer. One thing that at least I can say from this period, the Indians observed that the French did leave a better infrastructure in West Africa than the British did. Now, the Indians felt that the British had left a good infrastructure in India to build on. Railway, connectivity, factories, etc., etc. I do believe that in that sense, India had some foundation to build on. There's other similarities, though, I think, especially that countries like Senegal should build on, which is the university system. I think going back to this intellectual commonality, India has had a strong university system out of which a lot of students come and remain within the country. Even though there's a huge diaspora, there are opportunities for people within India. So it is important to invest in the university system within various African countries. I think Senegal is, I'm a stranger, but it looks better than other African countries. The university system here looks better. But it's important to keep investing in students and creating opportunities for students, for people, educated people to work here, not go to other countries, not experience the brain drain. So I think this is very important. I think India has been able to create opportunities. In fact, there are Indians who go abroad for education. They used to stay abroad, and now more and more Indians are coming back to live in India after leaving. I think this is very important. I also think Senegal and India share another commonality, which is a very high rate of women's education. If you look in many sectors, women are very, very strong in India, and I think this is also true in Senegal from what I see, and I think that has to continue. Girls' education, women's education, and women in leadership positions. It changes family structure for the better. The investments that each family makes in their own education and in their advancement. And become a producer and not an importer. I'm not an economist, but I think that's a fundamental issue.
Voilà, bon, donc on pourrait prendre une dernière question. Voilà, vraiment les toutes dernières questions. Et si vous voulez les faire courtes, on prend les deux questions en même temps. Elle répond brièvement et après on résume, si vous voulez. Voilà, si ça peut être... Okay.
Voilà, bonsoir, moi c'est Ibrahim Magnan, je suis sociologue. Je suis spécialisé beaucoup plus chez la Chine. Donc c'est ça qui m'a poussé à venir parce que quand on parle de l'Inde, donc je rapproche l'Inde par rapport à la Chine comme étant un pays émergent. Tout à l'heure, le collègue a cherché à savoir en fait quel modèle économique le Sénégal peut tirer de l'Inde pour bâtir son développement. Et si nous regardons un peu les deux, la Chine est considérée comme étant l'atelier du monde et l'Inde c'est le bureau du monde. C'est-à-dire que l'Inde a beaucoup plus développé des nouvelles technologies. Dans le secteur, dans le domaine des nouvelles technologies que l'Inde en fait s'est positionnée. L'Inde est aujourd'hui...
In light of what you have presented over here, I really like it, and that is part of also your openness, because as Leopold Sédar Senghor, asserts, keeping oneself deep rooted, while being open. So, and we all talk about pop culture, talk about economic achievements, and I think that without decolonizing the mind, any country, would emerge from poverty. And then that's why I really like this scholarship. And thank you so much for that, because I mentioned also when you did talk about that India has a lot to learn from Senegal. Yeah. So that combination, because usually, people might talk about westernization or the might or power from other countries, but usually they want other countries to learn from their country, but not the opposite. And I really like that from you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understood the questions properly.
But not, this one I'm nervous to tackle because I have my opinions, but I'm not sure. I think that the main point that I would say is that in the past, Africans have navigated relations with outsiders. Why not draw on that experience to negotiate between these powers again? In fact, I think that if you look at this example, the Senegalese took what they wanted. They didn't have to take everything. The other example in the Ahmadiyya in Ghana and other countries, while they were interested in the kind of Islam that they were teaching, they said, we're not going to cover our women that way. You might do that in India, but we're not doing that. So they took what they wanted and rejected the rest. They said, women are too important in our society in public for us to keep women in this way. I thought that was a very strong statement that Africans have negotiated their relationships with outsiders for centuries, and now is the time to do that. So Chinese model, Indian model, why not take the best from both?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that's, it doesn't have to be either or, in my view, but I'm not an expert. That is not my expertise. About the question about, I think bringing post-colonial subaltern perspectives into scholarship, and someone like Mamadou Diouf having done this, I think there are more scholars. Professor Mamadou Diouf has done this. Gaurav Desai, who has also written about particularly East Africa. What I really like about what Mamadou Diouf is doing is also this West Africa, the subaltern in West Africa in particular, because I do think there's a special kind of intellectual orientation that we should disaggregate different African perspectives and different Asian perspectives. And what I appreciated about Senghor is he understood that there is a very distinct identity in South India from North India, or Bengali identity from other identities. And so if we can talk about center-periphery also within our own societies, right? So in India, there are centers and peripheries. Maybe we can start to get at a more profound understanding or a deeper understanding of our own intellectual trajectories, or even the métissage within our societies, right? If we say this exists, what are the roots of various pieces that make up Senegalese as a blanket, or Indian as a blanket label? Can we go more specifically to that? And I think looking at center periphery within our own labels is a good exercise. And I think especially for Atlantic Africa, which has been in connection with the Atlantic world for more than 500 years now. We don't look for the authentic. Rather, we look for this movement of ideas, because that's the world that I see here in Senegal. Does that address the question?
Yeah. Donc, mais ce qu'on peut tirer de ce qu'elle nous a donné, c'est que peut-être qu'au XXIe siècle, essayons de relativiser ce qu'on appelle au fond le racisme. Qu'est-ce que c'est que le racisme? Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas de racisme au sein même de la même race? J'ai fait Ernest Gaines avec vous, et Ernest Gaines vous plonge dans les réalités de la Louisiane. En Louisiane, tous les blancs ne sont pas tous des blancs. Il y a des blancs qui sont plus blancs que d'autres ou supérieurs à d'autres. Les Cajuns, les Acadiens, qui viennent du Canada, et donc c'est des gens qui sont venus de France et sont installés au Canada, sont descendus et sont installés en Louisiane. C'est la dimension francophone de la Louisiane. Mais ces gens-là, ils sont inférieurs aux anglo-saxons. Chez vous, tout le monde est noir, mais tous les Sénégalais ne sont pas nécessairement tous Sénégalais de la même façon, surtout avant. Donc, relativiser cette question de race, relativiser cette question de différence entre nous, et voir au-delà de ça ce que l'on peut prendre les uns des autres. Que vous le vouliez consciemment, de toute façon, vous le faites. Que vous le refusiez, vous le faites. On prend toujours des autres et on ne s'en rend pas compte. Prenez un orchestre sénégalais, n'importe lequel. Il n'y a aucun groupe ethnique sénégalais qui puisse dire que cet orchestre me représente. Tous les groupes sénégalais s'y retrouvent. Parce que même dans les orchestres Wolof, maintenant le djembé a tout envahi. Et si vous ne faites pas attention, on va vous mettre le khalam, mais lequel? Le khalam des tout couleurs ou le khalam des Wolof? Et quand on parle de riti, le riti c'est entre les Peuls et les Sérères. Et la calebasse, qui peut dire que c'est la calebasse qui leur appartient? Ça appartient à tout le monde. Donc, il faut peut-être relativiser ça, ne pas prendre ça de manière trop émotionnelle. Et de ce point de vue, et toujours pour revenir à la littérature, en remerciant Madame de nous avoir fait prendre conscience de ces choses-là, pour vos lectures, en tout cas, ou pour cette dimension indienne, n'oubliez pas que la dimension indienne aussi existe dans la littérature d'Afrique du Sud. Hein? Je me rappelle le roman Cape Town Coolie, il y en a plein d'autres que je vais vous donner, mais je n'ai pas la liste ici. Vous pouvez aussi vous rapprocher de l'Inde en lisant le Bhagavad Gita, hein? Mais aussi vous pouvez voir un peu l'Inde ailleurs, lorsque les Indiens ont été renvoyés de l'Ouganda par Idi Amin Dada, ils sont partis, il y en a beaucoup qui sont partis aux États-Unis. Qu'est-ce que ça a donné? Le célèbre film avec Denzel Washington qui s'appelle Mississippi Masala. Bon, alors si vous voulez voir ce film-là, organisez-vous en groupe, venez voir Marianne, on vous donne le DVD et puis vous le regardez ici, ou bien vous inscrivez ça à Black History Month comme vous voulez. Hein? Donc, à nouveau, hein, nous sommes très contents de cette conférence-là qui a été donnée par notre ami sur l'Inde. Et nous sommes très contents de cette connexion avec le Centre de recherche ouest-africain, le WARC. Mais avant de libérer Shobana, je dis, si vraiment il y en a d'entre vous qui êtes intéressés par les réalités indiennes et croyez que autant on peut vous parler de Caribbean literature, autant on devrait pouvoir vous parler aussi de Indian literature. Et il y en a à boire, c'est la mer à boire. Et de ce point de vue-là, il faut sensibiliser les autorités de l'ambassade de l'Inde pour qu'ils fassent un effort. Et peut-être que Shobana, si Shobana les voit avant de rentrer aux États-Unis, qu'elle essaie de les convaincre de la nécessité d'introduire la littérature indienne au département d'anglais avec vos jeunes professeurs. Ce n'est plus un travail que je pourrais faire moi, c'est fini, c'est trop tard. Mais vos jeunes professeurs là-bas pourraient avoir des séjours là-bas et puis lire et venir aussi vous faire la restitution. Donc, Shobana, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And there's now a troupe performing.
Oh, ok. Vous avez une troupe qui va vous donner de la danse et de la musique indienne. Hein? Donc, après ici, vous transvasez de l'autre côté. C'est dans le jardin là-bas? C'est dans la cour là? C'est là où il y a le restaurant. Allez tranquillement vous asseoir et puis vous verrez ça et ça.
Donc, जलाए उसे तुम जलाओ तो होली है। बेरंग जिंदगी को तुम रंग में डुबाओ तो होली है। हसीना से है वो हसी, सारे रंगों से है वो रंगी, हर हसीना से है वो हसी। मैंने देखा उसे जब से यार हुआ बुरा हाल मेरा, ओ हुआ बुरा हाल मेरा। चांद तारों से मैं डोली सजा के, चांद तारों से मैं डोली सजा के उसे ले आऊंगा दुल्हन बना के। मेरे सवाल का बस वो जवाब है, यादों